A German shepherd appeared at the harbor at dawn, and a U.S. Marine knew the Gait instantly. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. It was just before dawn when James Carter stood at the harbor, his boots making soft echoes against the empty concrete. The air was still, the kind of quiet that only comes before the world fully wakes. The salty smell of the ocean mixed with the cool morning fog, drifting gently over the water. James gazed out over the horizon, his thoughts a million miles away. The years had been long since he last saw his partner, Shadow, a German shepherd who had served alongside him in the most trying of battles. He could still remember the weight of Shadow's fur beneath his hand, the way the dog's amber eyes had always been filled with unwavering loyalty. As the first rays of sunlight began to break over the harbor, something moved in the mist. James squinted, his heart skipping a beat. At first, he thought it was just another trick of the light, but then the figure emerged. A German shepherd, unmistakable even from a distance. The way the dog walked, slow but deliberate, the way its paws made soft sounds on the ground, it was the Gait. It was Shadow. Without a second thought, James' heart raced as he took a step forward, then another, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a wave. This was no mere coincidence. Shadow had returned. After all these years, after everything they had been through, James knew the dog's gait as though it had never changed. And just like that, the years of separation, the nights spent wondering what had happened, all melted away in that single moment. James felt something stir deep within him, a sense of recognition, a feeling of home. Shadow had found him, just as he always had. James took another step, moving toward the dog, his heart pounding in his chest, as the world around them seemed to pause. There was no need for words, they both knew what had been lost and what had been found. James moved closer, each step quickening as he got within feet of the dog. Shadow stood still, waiting. The familiar amber eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, it was as though no time had passed. The years, the distance, and the separation, none of it mattered. What mattered was the connection they shared, that deep, unspoken bond. James stopped just a few feet away, his breath catching in his throat. He crouched down, slowly reaching out his hand, trembling slightly. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The dog, as if understanding, took a small step forward, sniffing the air, and then, with a swift motion, closed the distance between them. Shadow's head lowered to meet James's hand. The touch was electric, sending a rush of warmth through James's chest. It was the same feeling he'd known during countless missions, the trust between soldier and companion, between man and dog. The years had done little to diminish it. Shadow let out a soft whine, his body shaking, but not from fear. It was a sign of relief, of joy. James's hand gently stroked the dog's fur, his fingers brushing through the familiar dark sable coat. "I thought I lost you forever," James said softly, a lump forming in his throat. Shadow's ears perked, and the dog gave a small nudge against his chest, as if to say that he had never truly been lost, only waiting for the right moment to return. James let out a shaky breath, his fingers brushing away the tears that threatened to fall. He had missed this bond, missed the comfort of having Shadow by his side. The moments on the battlefield had been full of chaos, but in those moments, with Shadow, he had always felt a little bit of peace, a little bit of hope amidst the madness. He had never expected this day to come. Shadow had been gone for so long, and the Marine had learned to live with the absence, to bury the pain deep down. But now, here they were. James rose to his feet, his hand still resting on Shadow's head, feeling the steady pulse beneath his fingers. "You're not going anywhere this time," James murmured, his voice steady, full of resolve. Shadow's tail wagged, a soft, rhythmic thump against the ground. James smiled, the first genuine smile he'd had in what felt like ages. The bond between them was unbreakable, and as they stood there together, the sun now fully risen over the harbor, James knew that nothing else mattered. Shadow was home, and together, they were ready to face whatever came next. James stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of Shadow at his side. The air around them seemed to carry a new weight, a sense of renewal, as if the universe itself had granted them this second chance. The harbor, once just a quiet place of solitude, now felt like a sanctuary. James could feel Shadow's presence next to him, solid and unwavering, as if nothing had changed, as if the years apart had not existed. For a brief second, James allowed himself to close his eyes, the cool breeze brushing past his face, mingling with the warmth of the early morning sun. It had been years since he had felt this calm, this grounded. And yet, the memories of the past still lingered. The missions, the danger, the sacrifices made, they had all led him to this point, to this reunion. He opened his eyes and looked down at Shadow, who was now sitting beside him, his ears perked, watching the world around them with the same sharp gaze that had once helped them navigate the chaos of battlefields. The dog's eyes locked with James's, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. They were back together. "We've been through so much, buddy," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Shadow's tail gave a soft thump against the ground in response, the sound so familiar that it brought a lump to James's throat. In the distance, the faint noise of the harbor came alive with the sounds of boats setting out for the day, the murmur of fishermen preparing for their work. But here, on the quiet edge of the dock, it felt as though the world was standing still just for them. James could hear his heart beating, steady and strong, and it made him realize how much he had missed feeling alive, how much he had missed this connection. This was not just a reunion. It was a promise fulfilled. Shadow had always been more than a dog. He had been a lifeline, a partner, a friend who never let him down, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. And now, that same dog was here, by his side, reminding him that no matter how much time had passed, loyalty never fades. "Let's go home, Shadow," James said, his voice soft but firm. The words felt natural, as if they had been waiting to be spoken all these years. Shadow stood up, his movements smooth and confident, and together, the two of them walked down the harbor path, the world beginning to feel whole again. For the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to smile, knowing that the journey ahead, no matter what it held, would be one they would face together. As the day progressed, James and Shadow made their way back to the small, rustic cabin nestled just outside the town. The sun was high now, casting golden light over the landscape. The air smelled of pine and earth, a familiar scent that had always felt like home. James opened the door and stepped inside, his boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. Shadow followed closely behind, his paws silent on the ground. The cabin was modest, but it held memories of quieter times, of the days before the world outside had turned chaotic. James set his pack down and looked around, his gaze lingering on the old leather chair by the fireplace, the worn rug on the floor. It all felt different now. The emptiness he had felt for so long seemed to vanish in an instant. With Shadow at his side, the cabin no longer felt like a place of solitude but a sanctuary. Shadow walked over to his bed in the corner of the room, lying down with a content sigh. James couldn't help but smile at the sight. After all these years, after so many unanswered questions, Shadow was home. He walked over and knelt beside the dog, running his fingers through the thick coat of fur. It was comforting, knowing that they were together again, and James allowed himself to breathe a little easier, to let the tension in his shoulders fade away. "We've come a long way, huh?" James said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Shadow's ears perked up, and he looked at James with those deep amber eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. It was as if the dog understood exactly what he meant. James smiled and stood up, stretching his arms above his head. The weight of the past seemed to lift with each movement. It had been a long road to get here, but now that he was home, now that Shadow was with him, he felt like he could finally move forward. He walked over to the window, looking out at the rolling hills and the forest beyond. The world was still out there, full of uncertainties, but for now, he had peace. Shadow was no longer just a memory. He was real, breathing, and standing by his side. For the first time in a long time, James felt like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. He turned back to look at Shadow, who was now lying with his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, completely content. "We'll figure it out, buddy," James said, a sense of determination in his voice. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Days turned into weeks, and James settled into a quiet routine at the cabin with Shadow. The mornings were still and peaceful, the sun rising over the hills, casting its golden light on the landscape. James spent his days repairing the cabin, working on small projects that had been left unfinished for too long. He found comfort in the simplicity of it all, working with his hands, watching the world outside his window, and knowing that Shadow was by his side. At night, they would sit together by the fireplace, the crackling of the fire filling the room, and James would stroke Shadow's fur, listening to the soft sounds of the dog's breathing. It was as if the world outside didn't exist, and in those moments, James could forget about the battles, the loss, the pain. It was just him and Shadow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a soft shade of purple, James found himself standing on the porch, looking out at the vast expanse of land before him. Shadow stood beside him, his body calm but alert, as though sensing something on the horizon. James felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of where he was and who he was with. It had been so long since he'd felt like this, whole, grounded, and at peace. The memories of the past still lingered, but they no longer held the same weight. The nightmares that had haunted him for so long had faded, replaced by the steady presence of his loyal companion. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" James murmured, his voice soft. Shadow's ears perked up, and the dog glanced up at him, those familiar amber eyes filled with something deeper, something unspoken. James smiled, rubbing the back of Shadow's neck. They didn't need words, they had always understood each other without them. "I don't know what's out there waiting for us, Shadow," James continued, "but I know we'll face it together. Whatever comes next, we've got each other." Shadow leaned into him, pressing his side against James's leg, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The world could change, the future could be uncertain, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. They were together, and that was enough. The night settled in around them, the stars beginning to appear in the clear sky above, and James knew that no matter where life took them next, they would face it side by side, with the same bond that had carried them through the toughest of times. Shadow had never let him down, and James knew he never would. As the weeks passed, James found that life at the cabin had become more than just a routine, it had become a sanctuary. The simplicity of the daily tasks, the quiet mornings with Shadow by his side, and the long walks through the woods had a way of healing the scars that had once seemed so deep. The land around them was vast and peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, James felt as though he was exactly where he needed to be. Shadow, ever loyal, stayed close, his presence a constant reminder of the bond they shared. The bond that had been forged in the most intense of circumstances, and now, it brought them both peace. One evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle above, James sat on the porch, his legs stretched out before him. Shadow lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, watching the world in quiet contentment. The air was crisp, the kind of crisp that hinted at the coming of fall, and James couldn't help but breathe it in deeply. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't running from something. He wasn't chasing the ghosts of his past. He was simply here, with Shadow, in the present. "We've made it, haven't we?" James said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Shadow's ears twitched, and the dog lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting James's. The bond between them, so strong and unspoken, seemed to speak louder than words ever could. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about living. About finding the beauty in the small moments, the quiet moments. About knowing that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing as he tilted his face up toward the sky. The stars shone brighter than ever, as if they were finally guiding him toward something more than the darkness he had known for so long. For so many years, James had lived in the shadow of the past. But now, with shadow at his side, he felt like he was finally stepping out into the light. No longer defined by the pain, the loss, or the battles he had fought, James felt free. He wasn't alone anymore. Shadow had found him, and they had found something even more important, peace. As the night stretched on, James sat quietly, knowing that no matter what challenges came their way, he and Shadow would face them side by side. There was no doubt in his mind. Together, they could face anything. And as he listened to the soft sounds of the night, with Shadow's steady breathing beside him, James finally understood what it meant to be home. The seasons began to change, and with each passing day, James felt more and more at home in the cabin. The warm, golden light of autumn filled the space, casting long shadows through the trees outside. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and there was a comforting stillness that settled over the land. James spent his days working on small projects around the property, maintaining the cabin, and clearing out the overgrown pathways. Shadow was always by his side, his loyal presence a constant reassurance. The bond between them had only grown stronger. It was as if they had both found a new purpose, one that didn't involve war, loss, or survival, but simply living. One morning, as James was walking down one of the narrow trails that led through the woods, he noticed something unusual. Shadow was moving ahead of him, his tail low, his nose to the ground. It was clear that the dog had picked up on something. James called out to him softly, "What is it, buddy?" Shadow stopped, looking back over his shoulder with those deep amber eyes, then continued on, his pace quickening. James followed, curiosity piqued, until they reached a small clearing. There, lying in the middle of the path, was a fox. It was breathing heavily, its fur matted with dirt, but it was alive. Shadow immediately stepped forward, sniffing the creature gently, as if assessing its condition. James knelt down beside Shadow, his heart heavy with concern. The fox didn't seem to have any visible injuries, but it was clear that it was exhausted. "What do you think, Shadow?" James whispered. The dog looked up at him, then back at the fox, his expression calm and steady. Without hesitation, James carefully scooped the fox into his arms, cradling it gently. Shadow watched, his posture alert but relaxed, as if understanding that they were now responsible for this creature as well. James took the fox back to the cabin, where he tended to it, offering it water and food. As the days went by, the fox slowly regained its strength, and James couldn't help but smile at the unexpected turn of events. He had always thought that it was just him and Shadow, two souls wandering through life together. But now, there was this small creature to care for as well, and somehow, it felt right. The fox, which James had named Ash, soon became a part of their daily life, following them around the property, always staying close to Shadow. The two animals seemed to form a quiet bond of their own, and James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had saved the fox, yes, but it was Shadow who had led him to it, who had made sure that they didn't turn away from an opportunity to help. That was the kind of bond they shared, unspoken, but strong. In the quiet days that followed, as the world around them slowly transformed into the deep hues of fall, James realized something. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a difference, no matter how small, and sharing that difference with those around you. Whether it was Shadow, Ash, or even the quiet days spent working the land, James knew that this was where he was meant to be, with his loyal companion and the world at his feet. As the months passed, the quiet life that James had built with Shadow and Ash felt more and more like a dream come true. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt full of life, of purpose, and of a sense of belonging that James had never known. The mornings were spent with the golden light streaming through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. Shadow and Ash had grown close, the German shepherd always keeping a watchful eye over the smaller fox, ensuring that no harm would come to it. They had become an inseparable pair, moving together with a calm, synchronized rhythm. James couldn't help but smile whenever he saw them, walking side by side, their quiet companionship a testament to the loyalty and trust that had defined his life. But despite the peace, James knew the world outside the cabin was still uncertain. It wasn't that he feared returning to the life he had once known, but he knew that time had a way of changing everything. One evening, as the last light of day faded and the air grew colder, James sat on the porch with Shadow lying at his feet. Ash, now fully recovered, curled up beside them, the three of them enjoying the calm of the evening. The fire pit in the yard crackled softly, the flames dancing in the cool night air. James stared up at the stars, lost in thought. It was hard to imagine that only a year ago, his life had been so different, filled with chaos, loss, and a constant fight to survive. Now, there was peace. There was purpose. "I never thought I'd get here," James said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Shadow lifted his head and looked up at him, those familiar amber eyes full of understanding. "I thought I was done," James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd never find my way back to something real." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all the years that had come before. Shadow shifted beside him, resting his head on James's knee, offering comfort without words. It was in these quiet moments, with the firelight flickering and the world outside still, that James realized how far he had come. The man he was now was different from the one who had walked away from the battlefield. He was stronger in ways he hadn't expected, not because of the wars he had fought, but because of the life he had built since. He looked down at Shadow, the loyal dog who had been with him through it all. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," James said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Shadow's tail thumped gently against the ground, and Ash, hearing the sound, lifted his head and looked around. The night was calm, the stars shining brightly above them, and for the first time in a long time, James felt truly at peace. No matter what the future held, he knew that he wouldn't have to face it alone. He had Shadow, Ash, and the life they had built together. And that, more than anything, was enough. As the days turned into weeks, James continued to find solace in the life he had built in the cabin. With Shadow and Ash by his side, every day felt like a gift. The seasons were shifting once again, and the first hints of winter had begun to arrive, bringing with it the crisp chill that had been missing for months. The leaves had long since fallen, and the trees now stood bare against the gray sky, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. Yet, there was a beauty in the silence, in the stillness of the world around them. James woke early each morning to the soft sounds of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the quiet crunch of Shadow's paws as he moved around the yard. It was a peaceful life, but it was also a life full of purpose. Each day, James felt more connected to the land, more in tune with the rhythms of nature. His work around the cabin continued, and with each project completed, he felt more at peace with himself. The firewood was stacked high for the winter, the roof was patched, and the garden was ready for the cold months ahead. Despite the work, the life James had built felt effortless, as though the land itself had welcomed him back, offering him a second chance at happiness. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, James sat by the fire, watching the flakes drift lazily past the window. Shadow lay at his feet, and Ash curled up beside him. The warmth of the fire contrasted with the coldness outside, and James couldn't help but smile. The world felt quiet and safe. As he sat there, lost in thought, he reflected on how far he had come. Just a year ago, he had been lost, unsure of where his life was headed, weighed down by the memories of battles fought and comrades lost. But now, surrounded by the warmth of his cabin, the company of Shadow and Ash, and the peace that had settled over him, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He was no longer defined by the past. The man he had been, the soldier who had fought in distant lands, was gone. In his place was someone who had found a sense of belonging, someone who had finally learned to live for today. The future no longer seemed so uncertain. For the first time in years, James felt like he was truly home. The fire crackled softly, and the snow continued to fall outside, a quiet reminder that the world was still turning. As the night grew deeper, James leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing for a moment as he let the warmth of the room envelop him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, he was content. Shadow was by his side, Ash was nestled at his feet, and the world outside seemed far away. In that moment, he knew that, no matter what came next, he would face it with the same strength, the same loyalty, and the same love that had brought him to this point. He was no longer alone. He had his family, and that was all he needed. Winter settled in fully, and with it came a quiet rhythm to life at the cabin. Snow piled high against the windows, blanketing the land in a thick layer of white. The fire inside crackled cheerfully, casting warm light on the small room, and outside, the world was silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. James had come to love the solitude, but it wasn't just the silence that brought him peace. It was the certainty that he was no longer running from anything, no longer weighed down by his past. He spent his days chopping wood, tending to the animals, and making small improvements around the cabin. Shadow was always at his side, the dog's watchful gaze never straying far from James. The bond between them had only grown stronger. Ash, too, had settled in, becoming a part of their little family. The fox had found its place in the world, and James couldn't help but marvel at how the three of them had come together. It was a life he never thought he would have, a life of quiet, steady peace. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snowy landscape, James stood at the edge of the woods, watching as Shadow ran through the snow, his paws kicking up plumes of white with every bound. Ash, too, was nearby, though more cautious in the deeper snow, watching with keen eyes. James smiled, a rare feeling of contentment filling him. This was what he had been searching for all along, he realized. Not the noise and chaos of the world, but the simple connection with the land, with the animals, and with himself. As the days grew shorter, James found himself thinking more about the future. The world outside the cabin was still there, still full of uncertainty, but he didn't feel the need to rush into it. For the first time in a long time, he felt no urgency. He had a purpose now, a reason to keep going, not just for survival, but for something deeper. He had a family in Shadow and Ash, and together they had built something real. The past no longer defined him. He was free. That evening, as they all gathered by the fire, James watched Shadow and Ash settle into their spots. The dog's head rested on his paws, his amber eyes half closed in contentment, and the fox curled up at the foot of the chair, its fur soft and warm against the cold air. James took a deep breath, letting the quiet of the cabin fill him. Outside, the wind howled softly, but inside, there was only peace. He knew that whatever came next, he was ready. He wasn't the man he had been, haunted by the past and unsure of the future. Now, he was a man with purpose, a man with a home, and a man who had found a kind of peace that could only come from embracing the present. He reached down and stroked Shadow's fur, the dog looking up at him with those familiar eyes. "We've got this, buddy," James murmured. Shadow's tail gave a soft thump against the floor, as if in agreement. James smiled and looked at Ash, who was now dozing peacefully by the fire. Together, they had created a life worth living, a life that, despite the challenges, felt more real than anything James had ever known. Winter had fully embraced the land, its icy fingers stretching across the landscape, turning everything to white. The cabin, nestled in the heart of the woods, stood firm against the cold, a place of warmth in an otherwise harsh world. James, Shadow, and Ash had settled into their rhythm, each day flowing into the next with the kind of steady peace James had never imagined possible. He spent the mornings outside, clearing the snow, gathering firewood, and tending to the animals, always with Shadow by his side. Ash, now fully comfortable in the cabin, often followed, though the fox preferred to stay close to the warmth of the fire when the weather turned too cold. The world around them had become a place of quiet, of simple comforts, and James had learned to savor it. There was a stillness in the air, one that felt different from the chaos of his past. It wasn't an absence of noise, it was the presence of something more profound, more peaceful. In the evenings, after a long day's work, they would gather inside, the fire casting its golden glow over the room. Shadow would lie at James's feet, his eyes half closed in contentment, while Ash curled up beside them, its soft breathing filling the space. James would sit back in his chair, feeling the weight of the day lift from his shoulders, and let himself relax for the first time in years. The quiet moments were the most precious, the ones that reminded him that he was no longer lost. He had found something here, something worth holding on to. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, James realized that he had come to cherish this life. It wasn't about running anymore, about fighting or surviving, it was about living. He had found his place, his home, and he had found peace in the companionship of Shadow and Ash. Life had a way of changing course, of bringing unexpected gifts, and James had learned to accept them. He had been given a second chance, one that he had never expected, and he wasn't going to waste it. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, James sat beside it, his gaze fixed on the flames. Shadow was resting at his feet, and Ash had curled up beside him, both animals offering the kind of quiet companionship that spoke volumes without words. James smiled softly to himself. "We've made it," he whispered. The dog's ears perked up, and Ash stirred beside him. James laughed quietly. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he continued, his voice filled with a warmth that matched the fire. The world outside was still, untouched by the passage of time, but in this moment, inside the cabin, time seemed to stand still. There was no need for anything else. Shadow, Ash, and the life they had built together were all that mattered. James had finally found the peace he had spent so long searching for, and he knew, without a doubt, that whatever the future held, he would face it with the same calm determination, side by side with his loyal companions. He wasn't alone anymore. He had everything he needed right here. Spring began to edge its way into the cabin's surroundings, and with it came a quiet sense of renewal. The snow that had blanketed the land for so long slowly began to melt, revealing the vibrant greens of the forest and the fresh buds on the trees. James spent more time outside now, the days growing longer and warmer. The sound of birds returning and the rustling of leaves as the wind passed through the trees filled the air, reminding him of the cycle of life that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. Shadow, ever watchful, stayed by his side, while Ash, now much more at ease in the cabin, often wandered the property, its curiosity growing as the weather changed. There was a lightness in the air, a promise that things would continue to grow, to change, and yet the stability James had found here remained constant. One morning, as the sun rose high in the sky, James stood on the porch, watching the landscape come to life. The earth had begun to thaw, and small wildflowers pushed their way through the soft, damp soil. Shadow sat beside him, tail thumping softly against the wooden deck, and Ash was curled up by the door, its head resting on its paws. For a moment, James just stood there, taking in the peaceful sight, the feeling of the earth beneath his boots, the warmth of the sun on his face. It was a quiet sort of happiness, the kind that didn't demand anything, that didn't require any special effort. It was simply the peace of being in the right place at the right time. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" James said softly, almost to himself. Shadow turned to look up at him, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. James smiled, a sense of gratitude filling him. He hadn't always known this kind of peace. There had been so many moments of doubt, so many times when he had felt like he was lost, but now, in this place, with Shadow and Ash by his side, he felt whole. Life had taken him on an unexpected journey, but it had led him here. And here was where he was meant to be. As the days grew warmer, James began to feel a shift within himself. It wasn't that the past was forgotten, it was simply that it no longer held the same power over him. The pain, the loss, the battles, all of it had shaped him, but it didn't define him anymore. He had found something deeper, something lasting. He had found a family in Shadow and Ash, and together, they had created a life that was his own. There was no rush, no urgency to get anywhere. The cabin, the land, the animals, it was enough. For the first time in years, James felt like he had everything he needed. And for the first time in years, he was no longer haunted by what he had left behind. The future, whatever it held, was just another chapter in the story they were living together. James took a deep breath, looking out over the land, knowing that no matter what came next, he would face it with the same strength and peace that had carried him this far. And with Shadow and Ash by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. As the days passed, the change in seasons brought a new kind of energy to the cabin. The warmth of the sun in spring brought new life to the land, and James felt a renewed sense of purpose as he worked outside. Shadow and Ash, now fully settled into their routines, were his constant companions. The bond between them was unspoken but deep, and it was a connection that grew stronger with each passing day. They had all found their place here in this small, quiet corner of the world. The cabin, surrounded by the forest, felt like a home that was built not just from wood and stone but from the moments they shared together. One morning, as James worked in the garden, planting seeds for the summer crops, Shadow stayed by his side, lying on the ground nearby, watching him intently. Ash, too, seemed content, its eyes following James's every movement. The simplicity of it all filled James with a quiet joy. He had once thought that the life he had now was impossible, that the peace he had found would always be out of reach. But now, surrounded by nature, by the animals he loved, and by the life he had made, he understood something fundamental. This was enough. He didn't need anything more. The world outside the cabin still existed, but it no longer felt like something that could intrude on his life. The past, too, had faded into something less immediate, something more like a distant memory. It didn't haunt him anymore. It had shaped him, yes, but it was no longer the thing that defined him. He was defined by the present, by the life he was living now. By the mornings spent tending to the garden, the evenings by the fire, and the quiet companionship of Shadow and Ash. That was what mattered. Later that afternoon, after finishing the garden work, James and Shadow walked through the woods, their footsteps muffled by the fresh layer of fallen leaves. The air was crisp, but not cold, and the trees stood tall around them, their branches stretching toward the sky. James paused for a moment, taking in the peaceful scene before him. The forest was quiet, the only sound the rustle of the leaves as the wind blew through the branches. Shadow, ever watchful, stayed close by his side. James felt a deep sense of gratitude. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. No longer in the chaos of the world, no longer lost in the noise, he had found his place in the world, and it was here, with Shadow, with Ash, and with the life they had built together. The future was still uncertain, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They had everything they needed right here. Together, they had built a life of quiet purpose, and that was more than enough. James smiled as he looked down at Shadow, the dog's amber eyes meeting his with an understanding that went beyond words. "We've got this, buddy," James said softly, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his past completely lifted. The future didn't need to be figured out right now. They would face it together, just as they always had.